Hey everyone. So here we go. We continue in our Gospel of John. I've personally really enjoyed the depth of this gospel in a way that I even haven't before. I hope you guys are as well. As we continue in this today, we've just finished the feeding of the 5,000, and they've tried to make him king by force. He has disappeared because he doesn't want anything to do with that. And so we get into this world now where we're going to find more and more opposition to Jesus with the things he says. He's misunderstood. And so it's very important at this point that this next section happens. And this next section is probably the highest divinity claim, but he does it not through his words, but his actions. So he only actually says one sentence in this whole section on the walking of the water. You will notice that the walking of the water in this gospel is different than the other gospels. There are minor differences. Please remember that the gospels were written in such a way as to tell us a bigger story about God. It's not because they have different perspectives on an issue. They're very being very artistic, and the way John tells his walking on the water is very connected to his whole principle of how he's telling us to read this book. He starts the gospel within the beginning. We know that this is a creation narrative, a creation motif. So we know that he's going to be telling his story through that as the bigger lens. There's also, as you know by now, a major Exodus theme in John's gospel, but there would be a major Exodus theme in all the gospels because that was how the Jews saw themselves. You couldn't tell a first century theological story without the Exodus being involved in it. So here we go. Let's get into it. Well, first of all, like I said, it starts in the creation. This is based on creation, this story. And so how does the creation story begin? Well, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, which we know. The earth was without form and void, which means, and darkness was over the face of the deep. What this all means is the way he says this, without form or void. This is disorder. This is chaos. There's nothing, there's no form to it. So it's disordered at best. And what happens is that this is the beginning. It's interesting. Most people think God creating everything was perfect. Actually, whatever's going on in this creation story, what he's saying is it isn't perfect. There's no form, there's no void, there's disorder, there's chaos in the deep. And he says the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So the Spirit of God, or the breath of God, as this case may be, it can mean both, are the elements that are going to begin to bring order out of the chaos. So that's very important for us to understand, and that God will bring order out of this watery chaos. That is, by the way, in every creation narrative, whether it's pagan or ours, water is always seen as chaos. In the pagan cases, it represents a god, something very dark, often at battle with the good god or the god of light. And in our case, there isn't a battle of deities, obviously, because we only believe in one God. But the chaos or waters always represents chaos. We must always remember that. And the ancient world, you can imagine why. They didn't have understandings of weather, so they could take off on their boat on a beautiful, clear day to go fishing. Their family waves goodbye, and their family never sees them again because a storm kicks up. They were terrified, and the Jews were not a seafaring people. So they were particularly sensitive to the chaos of water, as we see again and again. Now, there was only one being that controlled the waters according to Jews, and that was, of course, Yahweh. Where in Job, we can see it here, he says, or who shut in the sea with the doors when it burst out from the womb, when I made the clouds its garment and a thick dark its swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it and set bars and doors, and says, thus far you shall come and no further, and here shall your proud waves be stayed. Job's telling the story that it is God who's in control of the seas and the weather, and there's nothing else that can control those things in the ancient world. And you could argue today, of course. The psalmist, in his case, the voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of the glory thunders, the Lord over many waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. So he has it again. This time it's the word of the God or voice of God that is sitting there keeping the waters at bay. He is in control of the waters. So let's get into this text with that in mind, with the creation story in mind, that it is the Spirit that calms the chaos, the disorder in the creation narrative. And let's see what happens here, because we're going to run into a storm. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark. Now, if you can't see those correlations, what was it in the creation story? Void. There was no form or void. And there was darkness over the deep. In this case, we've got another sea, and they've got darkness over the sea. You can see why John emphasizes that. And Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. Apparently, the Sea of Capernaum has this factor that it's below sea level. And I don't understand. I'm not a meteorologist. I'm just letting you know what I've read. And when the winds come down, the hot winds come down from the earth to the cold winds, somehow it sends up incredible storms, unbelievable storms. So the Sea of Capernaum was known for its very quick and very drastic storms. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, there's no reason, this isn't even the numbers used in the original Greek. They're translating the distance for us to 3 to 4 miles. They use this word called stadia for distance. They saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat. Oh, wow, that's something else, because one thing they know is that no one controls the seas. No one walks on the seas except Yahweh himself. Just to give you an example, Job describes it this way: He alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea. In another psalm, which I'll emphasize on Sunday, it talks about God walking on the water. It's an Exodus psalm, and leaving no footprints. The one thing that they knew in the ancient world, and especially as good Jews in the ancient world, what they knew is that no human being walked on water. Now, in the other story telling of this event, the disciples were afraid because they thought it was a ghost or a phantasma. They did believe that there were demonic or malevolent beings that existed in chaos, and so they believed they lived in the ocean. So that was what they were afraid of there. But one thing they did not believe, so they believed those things could be, but they weren't human or God. They were like this demonic presence, is the best way to describe it. The point of this is that nobody but God walks on the water. So when it says Jesus is walking on the sea and coming near the boat, that's the point they're saying. And they were frightened. They weren't frightened from the phantasma. They were frightened because nobody walks on water. Nobody does this stuff. Who is this man? They say in another telling of the story in another gospel. We end up with this incredible situation where Jesus, by just doing this action, he doesn't have to say any more. He is proclaiming that he is God. So what Jews know about God is that you can't face God face to face. You will die. They know that. He is good and holy, and human beings are neither. And that's why we can't stand in front of them. So they have every right to have a fear of the Lord come over them. And here we have this situation where, and then we get into this situation where he sit there and he comes near them and they're frightened. But then he says to them, and this is this wonderful response that's going to be right out of the Exodus story. It's going to proclaim. So he's walking on it. He's not denying it. And then he says, I don't like our translation. It says, it is I. The actual wording is ego eimi. I am. I am is the name of God in the Old Testament. So he says, God, I am God. And then he says, oh, they should be afraid. And they're not afraid notice of the storm anymore because there's something far greater now to be afraid of. Now they have to be afraid. But then he says, and this is the God of the Old Testament, every time he sends an angel, every time that the angel of the Lord or he has a theophany, people are frightened, terrified. They fall on their faces. And every time God has to say, do not be afraid. Again, he's saying to them, in the middle of this chaos, God is with them. They're not afraid of the chaos, but they are afraid of God. And then God says, but you don't have to be afraid. Though you should be afraid because I am the God who controls the waves. I could destroy everything in 1 minute, in a second. The the reality is, here I am, and he's telling them that in this chaos, even though they have very poor faith, even though they don't understand and they're sinful men, he is saying to them, already this is a grace act. Do not be afraid. Then he says this section in the end, which is very interesting. He says, then they were glad to take him into the boat. Notice they weren't glad to take him in the boat before he says, do not be afraid. There's almost something about that you have to get past the fear of God to invite Jesus into your boat, if you see what I mean. There's definitely something there. And immediately it says, the boat was at the land which they were going. Why does he say an immediately? Well, so that's a miracle too. They're in the middle of the sea, and now they're immediately where they were supposed to be, where they were going. Well, here we also have a fulfillment of a psalm. And you're saying, well, there's lots of fulfillment stuff. There is. John's just throwing it at us. And the psalm is actually a reference out of a seafaring people who was afraid. And what he's saying by quoting this immediately they got there, and why Jesus does this miracle, is to point that he's the God of this psalm that rescues people. So the psalm itself is Psalm 107. Some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep, and that means they saw the storm coming. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. So we got the similar situation as here. They mounted up to heaven. They went down to the depths. In other words, their boat is going up and down, as you've seen in videos, I'm sure, of ships doing that. Their courage melted away in their evil plight. When it says their courage, it doesn't mean they're evil, they're doing evil. It just means that the evil plight is the situation. Chaos has come. They're in the middle of chaos. They reeled and staggered like drunken men, and they were at their wits' end, which was, you can imagine if you were in a great storm. Then they cried, and this is the key, then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. What's being fulfilled right now is these guys are in trouble, and God is delivering them. So this is the God who delivers. And who's the one who delivers here? Jesus. You can see how this works. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea he hushed. Then they were glad that the waters were quiet, and immediately, it says, brought them to their desired heaven, if you have the original translation. So this is the fulfillment of that he's the God who, when the storms come, he's the one who you cry out to, but it's now Jesus Christ. And he comes in and he's the savior out of the chaos. So they're in chaos on the sea, just like the original chaos. The God of, and they're in the dark. I mean, you can see this correlation. The God who controls the waves shows up. He's walking on water, which only God can do. He brings them, he shows them that. He says, it is I, ego eimi. So he announces who he is, and then he says, do not be afraid, which is the key. Then they're willing to bring him in because they're terrified of being one-on-one with God. I'm sure they wondered about this after, because none of them expected God to come. So the greater God comes, and he stops the waves from being, the storm from happening, and all of a sudden you've got the fulfillment of the psalm, which says that it's the Lord who brings the saving when they cry out. He becomes the Lord. He is God in their midst. And this is how this is all fulfilled. All right, so let's look at some questions. Knowing the sea is chaos, what is this ultimately telling us about chaos in the world? So see if you guys can come with some ideas on that. Does understanding this story help us understand why there is no sea in the end of Revelation with the coming of the new heavens and the new earth? And what I mean to reference there is Revelation 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first earth and the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. So maybe this will help us understand. You can talk about what the sea means and why Revelation wants it not there at the end, if it's going to be a good creation, new creation. And how might this sign help the disciples for what is about to occur in the ministry of Jesus in the next couple of years for them? Why was this sign given to them, and why does it matter? All right, see ya.